Thank you all for tuning in today to webinar about how we're planning for natural hazards through our draft new belief switch planning scheme. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded. This recording will only capture our presentation materials and myself. Your faces, names, and other details will not be shown, and your privacy will be protected. We'll be posting this to our website next week, so you'll be able to revisit any of the content we've covered today. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners as custodians of the land and waters we share. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging as the keepers of the traditions, customs, cultures, and stories of our proud peoples. Council is seeking feedback on its draft planning scheme. The purpose of this session is to provide more information on how the planning scheme will address natural hazards, particularly flood and bushfires, to strengthen the resilience of our communities. We'll address some of the questions you've asked, show you how this applies to the city and at a property level, and show you where you can go to get more information. We'll also walk you through the process of making a formal submission on the planning scheme so you can provide your feedback or raise other factors that Council should consider. Today's session is about providing general information, so we won't be able to answer all of your questions about the scheme. Consider how our team will make note of any questions asked today and come back to you with a considered response. The planning scheme acts as a rulebook of planning and guiding development in our city. It guides the way land and buildings are used, how infrastructure is delivered, and how we balance growth and change with protection of what matters most. Council have drafted a new planning scheme that will set out a vision for the next 20 years of our city centred on the following themes: great places, infrastructure, housing, resilient communities, open space and the environment, transport and movement, economy and employment, heritage and cultural values. Today, we'll be focusing the theme of resilient communities and the role of Bushfire City Council and the planning scheme in guiding development that aims to reduce the risk of natural hazards to people and property and improve the community's capacity to respond to and recover from natural events. Planning schemes also work within the state government's planning policies to identify and manage large-scale risks such as flooding and bushfires. They include requirements for developments to address a range of natural hazards, such as bushfires, flooding, steep topography, and landslides. These are all listed as state interest matters by the Queensland Government, and it is a requirement that they are appropriately reflected in the new switch planning scheme. The key way hazards are addressed in the scheme is through planning overlays. These are shown as online maps with layers that display additional values and associated planning considerations that may be needed for new development on a property. Overlays have a range of purposes that may show land that is sensitive to development or areas that provide opportunities or constraints. The planning scheme includes a range of overlay maps that identify the risk of different natural hazards to people, property, infrastructure, the environment, and the economy. In addition to this mapping, overlays usually have codes that guide and set specific requirements for how a property can be used or developed. These requirements improve our community resilience to natural hazards while making sure the right development ends up in the right places. They also help reduce their impact by encouraging the use of more sustainable building materials for new homes and developments. It's important to consider overlays and zones in the early stages of development design. Overlays show you the development opportunities and constraints you need to consider, while zoning mapping and codes outline the types of activities and developments that are expected in your area. Together, they play an important role in determining whether a proposed development is appropriate for the location and what type of development application might be required. Overlays are mapped using the most relevant information available, which may be held by the Council or the state government. Specific studies commissioned by Council also contribute to overlays, such as local flood studies. To strengthen resilience of our communities to natural hazards, the draft planning scheme includes key changes to some overlay mapping, particularly for flood and bushfires. Once these changes are adopted, they'll apply to new developments, extensions, and major changes to existing development, but the existing lawful use of a property won't change. The Flood Risk and Overland Flow Overlay Code. What is it? Development in Ipswich has historically been focused along the Bremer and Brisbane rivers and Eastern Creek. Our subtropical climate also means that we're likely to experience flooding in the future. Following the flood events in February and May last year, Council undertook the 2022 Ipswich Floods Review, which included consultation with the community. During this consultation, people raised concerns about the historical approval of developments on floodplains and told us they wanted more transparency on flooding issues in the assessment process. The changes we've made to the flood risk and overland flow overlay in the new planning scheme has considered this feedback. We've also given consideration to how we can address future risks through land use planning. We've taken a risk-based approach to preparing our new planning scheme and mapping to ensure that future development decisions are made based on a full understanding of flood risk. This aligns with the findings from our own consultation, as well as the Flood Commission of Inquiry, Brisbane River Strategic Floodplain Management Plan, the Planning Act 2016, and the State Planning Policy. To do this, we've considered the likelihood of different flood events, the potential impacts of different flood behaviours such as depth, velocity, and isolation, climate change factors, options for mitigating flood risk, the implications of flood risk on our growth and planning objectives, and the vulnerability of our communities to flood events. This has resulted in the preparation of a flood-responsive land use policy. So what's changed? Our current overlay mapping identifies two types of flooding, which are based on long-standing historic development control lines and previous flooding occurrences. The 1 in 20 development line, adopted flood regulation line, and the major open catchment flow paths. The updated mapping in the new draft planning scheme identifies 5 categories or bands of flood risk, which identifies the frequency and severity of flooding: extreme risk, high risk, medium risk, low risk, and very low risk. This overlay also comprehensively maps overland flow areas. These are places where water typically runs across the land after rainfall and should be considered in certain circumstances. It's important that we identify these places in our mapping due to the potential safety impact on people and properties. Changes in terrain, landscaping, new buildings and structures also have the potential to result in impacts to properties as a result of overland flow. The mapping also shows priority evacuation areas, which are at-risk areas that may require early evacuation or additional disaster management options. Lastly, it includes flood-resilient precincts, which are located in or near major and principal centres, where the past pattern of development means that there is greater transport and services. However, these areas should continue to develop providing the identified flood risk is appropriately managed. So how could it affect you? In addition to this updated mapping, there have been changes to the flood risk and overland flow overlay code. The 5 bands of flood risk can each trigger specific requirements for how land can be used and developed and how this will be assessed. If this overlay applies to your property, you may need to lodge a development application for certain works or development. This will ensure new developments appropriately consider and address flood risk, including any potential risk to life, property, and the environment. Depending on the type of development you want to do and the flood risk on your property, you may need a specific assessment by your building certifier or a certified hydrologist or flood engineer. The new mapping could also have an impact on your future development potential. In developing the new scheme, Council has undertaken a risk assessment to determine where and how development should occur in areas of different flood risk, and whether development is accepted, tolerable, or intolerable. Where the risk has been assessed as intolerable, changes to zoning may have been proposed. For example, a portion of land may be included in an environmental management zone or one similar. Development potential may have been reduced, such as from medium density residential zoning or to a change to low density residential. In some cases, where the risk is intolerable and in an extreme flood risk has been identified, the limited development zone may have been applied. All these circumstances have been assessed and reported as part of the Feasible Alternative Assessment Report, the FAAR. This has been provided on Council's website as part of the consultation process. If the property report identifies changes to the overlay mapping for your property, we would encourage you to review and make comment on this report. You can also learn more about the flood risk and overland flow overlay code and how it applies to development in Part 8 of the draft planning scheme. Bushfire prone areas overlay. What is it? The bushfire prone areas overlay mapping shows the bushfire risk across the Ipswich local government area. It's derived from the statewide mapping of bushfire hazard, which is produced by the state government in support of their state planning policy. Under the new planning scheme, there are changes to how this overlay is mapped and where the mapping applies. What's changed? Well, the current mapping for bushfire prone areas includes 2 categories: bushfire risk and transitional bushfire risk. These categories are defined by how close they are to urban expansion. The mapping in the new planning scheme uses updated data and fire signs to assess the level of bushfire hazard for different areas. This assessment takes into consideration the three most significant natural input factors: the potential weather severity, such as how hot and dry the weather is, the slope of the land, with fires going upslope becoming more intense, and the fuel load of different vegetation types and their density. It also considers the history of bushfire events in the Ipswich region, like 2019 bushfires that impacted Bundamba, Wookaraka, South Ripley, and Lower Mount Walker. Based on these factors, three levels of hazards have been identified: medium, high, or very high potential bushfire intensity. The mapping also considers the potential impacts to surrounding areas by including a new surrounding buffer of 100 metres. So how could this affect you? The new mapping will help council and the community be better prepared for and protected from the impacts of bushfire. However, this does mean it is more comprehensive than the previous mapping and applies to a greater number of properties. If the bushfire-prone areas overlay applies to your property, you may be required to lodge a development application for certain works or development. Because any building works will also need to be assessed for the resistance to bushfire and ember attack, an assessment of your development proposal will also be required. In some cases, this will be completed by a building certifier or bushfire expert. You can learn more about the Bushfire-Prone Areas Overlay Code and how it applies to development in Part 8 of the planning scheme. You can use our website to view the zones and overlays that apply to property and the wider Ipswich area. I encourage you to join me now as I take you through this process. First, head to shapeyouripswich.com.au/UIpswich planning scheme. Scroll down the page until you see view the draft, new planning scheme and mapping. Select this to be taken to the Draft Ipswich Plan 2024 page. Now you're ready to search for your property. Once you type in your address, it will show up above the search bar as an option to select. On the left-hand side of the page, you can view information about your property, including the zones and overlays that apply. For example, this property is in the principal centre zone. You can use the checkboxes to select or unselect any mapping layer. Below the zone, there is also a link to view the relevant section of the planning scheme. Selecting this will take you to the section on the zone code so you can read more about its purpose and how it applies to development. You can hit the back button on your browser to return to the planning scheme mapping. You can select Map Tools on the right-hand side of the page to view all the different zones and overlays and where they apply across Ipswich. Underneath this is a legend, which shows what each of the layers look like. This helps you easily see where different layers apply across the map. For a PDF report of this information, select View Property Report on the left-hand side of the page. We encourage everyone to provide their feedback on the draft new planning scheme. The best way to do this is by making a formal submission. Your submission can voice support, raise concerns, or provide suggestions for all or part of the proposed draft planning scheme and mapping. To make it count, Council must receive your submission before the consultation closes on Sunday, the 16th of July, 2023. The easiest way to make a submission is online through shapeyouripswich.com.au. But you can also lodge a submission by post, in person, or via email. To make your submission online, head to shapeyouripswich.com.au and select the new Ipswich Planning Scheme project. Scroll down the page until you see the Make a Submission button. Select this to be taken to the submission page, which includes a template that you can fill out. Before you begin, we recommend reading the How to Make a Submission fact sheet. We've included a link to this on the page. If your submission relates to a specific property, make sure you enter the street address or lot. Next, select any topics or parts of the planning scheme that your submission relates to. Now you can provide your written submission. Make sure you include any supporting grounds, facts, and circumstances. You can also attach any relevant supporting materials. Before submitting, we'll ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and provide some contact details. Once all the submissions have been reviewed, we'll also get back to you to let you know how your feedback has been considered alongside all the other submissions that have been received. Now you're ready to submit. Thank you for taking the time to tune in today and learn more about the draft new Ipswich planning scheme. This is the last of our 3 webinar sessions we've held on the planning scheme. We're also running drop-in sessions at Ipswich libraries across the city. You can use these as an opportunity to talk to one of our planners and better understand how the new planning scheme might affect your property and area. You'll be able to find a recording of this session along with our first webinar explaining the planning scheme and our second on how we're planning for the environment and biodiversity on Shape Your Ipswich next week. For anyone who shared specific questions about your situation or property when registering or for this session or in the chat today, our team will be reaching out to you by email with a response. You can also reach out to our planning team anytime during the consultation process to ask questions or have a chat about the planning scheme. You can contact us over the phone, via email, or in writing. Thank you for taking the time to tune in today and learn more about the draft New Ipswich planning scheme.